Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We have another Brookings Institution Heritage Foundation pairing for you today, speaking with two analysts that have different points of view on what to do about polarization in the media and its impact on government policy. Up first is Darrell West, Vice President for Governance and Founding Director of the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution. He'll be followed in the second half of our show by Mike Gonzalez, Vice President of Communications at the Heritage Foundation, who took umbrage with the recommendations made by Brookings that he sees as an attempt by the left to regain control of the media. Darrell, welcome to the show.
Nice to be with you, Bill.
Darrell, along with Beth Stone, you recently authored a paper titled Nudging News Producers and Consumers Toward More Thoughtful, Less Polarized Discourse. What do you mean by nudging?
Nudging basically refers to there are small steps that people can take to encourage others to act in certain respects. So, for example, with retirement programs, companies have found that as opposed to waiting for employees to opt into a particular retirement program, if they automatically enroll them and give them the option to opt out if they don't want to do it, just that simple change in moving from a required program to something that is not required can make a big difference in consumer behavior. So we apply this concept to the world of news media. We have a lot of news organizations today that basically encourage people to read things based on what is most popular. With many newspapers, for example, they will have a list on their website. Mm-hmm. You know, these were the most widely viewed stories over the last week, so therefore you should read this based on the fact that they are popular. We suggest popularity should not be the only criterion, that maybe news outlets should think about what are the most thoughtful pieces and try and steer readership to those kinds of articles.
The FCC recently backed down from a plan to send inspectors into the newsrooms of radio, TV, and even print newspapers to ask a fairly intrusive set of questions about their editorial philosophies and policies. The stated goal was to ensure that Americans' critical information needs were being met. Was this a form of nudging?
I don't see that as a form of nudging. This sounds much more heavy-handed, and it's not something that I would endorse. I don't think it's really the role of government to be playing that kind of role. When we talk about nudging, we're talking about voluntary actions on the part of search engines, websites, portals, and other digital organizations to try and encourage people to do good things. But this is purely a voluntary effort. If companies don't think that's the way to go, obviously they don't have to do it.
And let's stick with this for a moment, and particularly when it comes to polarized discourse. I've been following this story quite closely. The right-leaning media went ballistic over the proposal, claiming it was a step toward politically motivated censorship, and the left-leaning media pretty much buried the story. How would a less polarized media have handled this?
I mean, the problem that we face today is so much of our political discourse is highly polarized, that when you look at the viewership of leading shows in terms of audience demographics, we have a lot of shows, for example, on Fox, where 67 or 80% of the audience is Republican. Same thing applies in terms of NBC, in terms of, they have mostly a liberal and more democratic audience. So we need to figure out ways to decrease that kind of polarization. And so we suggest that we need more thoughtful coverage. Reporters should get away from this Noah's Ark approach to reporting. They often think if they follow kind of the 2x2 approach, one liberal, one conservative, that reflects a balance. The American public often has a much wider range of views. So, they might think about a liberal, a centralist, and a conservative. They might think about people who have unconventional views. We just need greater diversity in the sourcing for our news coverage.
Do you think we'd see more than two sides to news stories if two political parties didn't have a lock on our political system?
Well, certainly there are many aspects of our system that encourage people to fall into one of two categories, liberal or conservative, Republican or Democrat. But the news media needs to kind of get beyond that and understand that they have a role in incorporating a much broader range of views. We have a lot of diversity of viewpoints on the conservative side. You have kind of the traditional Republicans, you have Tea Party people, you have libertarians. The news coverage should reflect all of those kinds of perspectives. We need to kind of get beyond the simplistic approaches that people often think about today and think about, how do we make our news coverage much more thoughtful?
I grew up in an era when there were 3 TV networks and the New York Times, and together they totally dominated news coverage. When in American history have we had more diversity of reporting than today?
We certainly have a great diversity of reporting in the sense of there are thousands or millions of websites. There are many different types of digital sources. The problem is that people still often rely on a very limited number of outlets, and so they are not availing themselves of the full diversity that is out there. So one thing we suggest for consumers is they need to understand there is great diversity out there, and they need to make use of it. It's kind of like in the 1790s and in the 1890s, many American cities had 7 or 8 different newspapers. They often each reflected a particular partisan point of view. People read multiple newspapers because they understood that if you relied just on one, you were going to get a very biased point of view. But if you drew on several of them and kind of incorporated each of their perspectives, you'd probably come closer to having a good understanding of the issues. So we think that's a good way that consumers can do a better job of getting information and protecting themselves in an era of high polarization.
Well, it's never been easier to do that than now. Are you familiar with a program called Zeit?
I haven't seen that, no.
You should look into it. I use it on the iPad, but it's basically a newsreader where you are the editor-in-chief, and you set up all your sections just like the sections in a newspaper, and it scours the entire internet for stories and presents them in a magazine format that you can flip through, so you get a lot of serendipity. You can say like or not like, so you can tune it up towards your interest. It's a very, very easy way to graze many, many different media outlets. And as these things proliferate, it should get easier, not harder, to do this.
I mean, newsreaders certainly represent an opportunity for people to take control of their own news consumption. They can set the parameters of particular interests they have or particular perspectives that they want to read, and then the newsreader will draw on stories that fit into that. The only thing we have to worry about with newsreaders is sometimes it creates filter bubbles in which people basically only want to get one point of view. They want to get things that reinforce their existing views as opposed to reflecting a broader range of viewpoints.
Isn't that the consumer's choice?
It is a consumer's choice, but in an era of high polarization, we have a lot of people who are basically getting only one perspective. And so it becomes harder for policymakers to address problems today because not only is there a range of different opinions out there, but oftentimes people have their own facts because they're in these particular bubbles. So we need to kind of understand that polarization is a huge challenge today in the contemporary politics, and we need to think about ways that we can start to break that down.
So who is it you're trying to educate? Are you trying to educate the consumers? Are you trying to educate the news producers? Or are you trying to educate the news distributors?
Really all of the above. Our paper was really aimed at producers and consumers in particular, but I would include news distributors in that as well. It's like everybody needs to understand that there are things that they can do that would lead them towards better news coverage and more information about the topics they care about. So some of our recommendations are really aimed at people who run search engines and operate news portals to try and get them to link to a broader range of things. We have some recommendations for journalists in terms of news sourcings, in terms of trying to get them to not just go to the same old people time and time again, but draw on a broader range of sources. And then also there are things that news consumers themselves can do to protect themselves against polarization and try and draw on a broader range of viewpoints.
Your report recommends that search engines should rank search results not just by popularity but by quality. Who should be the judge of quality?
The traditional person within any news organization who made quality decisions was editors. And so we're suggesting that even in this era of crowdsourcing and digital news sources, that there still is a role for editors on news sites and on portals, that there are people whose job is to think about the news, to evaluate sourcing, to think about what is more thoughtful or what is more innovative, and that they can use their expertise to then let others know not only what is the most popular stuff, but what is the most thoughtful. The problem with the popularity standard is it leads us to the Lady Gagas and the Britney Spears of the world. And there certainly is a market for that stuff, but we need to kind of think about some criteria that might also lead people to innovative or thoughtful thinking.
Let's take two perfect examples. One is Google, which cannot possibly have editors because they can't scale given all the things that they do. They have to have algorithms. And the other is Real Clear Politics, where they have editors who generally pick stories, and they try to pair them up. If you go to Real Clear Politics, very often you'll see two stories directly contradicting each other, one from the left, one from the right, and you get the chance to click and read both of them. How do you suggest that either of those organizations change what they're doing?
I mean, Real Clear Politics does a very good job at incorporating diverse viewpoints. I often go to that site. I find it very interesting because it's kind of a quick summary of what an editor has judged to be the important news contributions that day, commentary that others would find useful. And so it's kind of a good place for people to go to find a range of different viewpoints. Google doesn't have editors, but that doesn't mean that it's not editing and making choices. When you look at the search engine, part of it is based on popularity, and so sites that have more links to other sites do get advantage in the searches. But Google also, in its current algorithms, does highlight particular things. It tries to find biographical material on prominent people, so it might elevate the Wikipedia page for those individual or the individual bios for those individuals. So Google is making choices even in its search engine. It's not kind of a completely egalitarian system where everybody makes whatever choices they want.
But there's no quality knob as you might define quality in terms of a news source.
There's no quality knob in terms of the current algorithms, but there's no reason why they couldn't do that. There certainly are ways in which they advantage certain types of content over others based on how they weight particular factors in their algorithms. And so we're just suggesting that they think not just about the crowd, but about the curation of that information or the editing role. And that, if there are certain sites that have a strong reputation as providing good content, that those sites could be nudged up a little bit in the search rankings.
Now you use another word, good. Who defines good?
Well, ultimately, the market of information is going to define good. We certainly are not calling for any central authority to do that. We don't want government to play that role. It would be dangerous if, any small group of people did that. We want to basically think about, in the digital world, ways to encourage people to draw on the range of information that is out there. Our big concern about the current period is the hyper polarization that we see. Liberals and conservatives often have different facts, which then makes it difficult for them to talk to one another, understand each other's viewpoint, and then in our political system, it's hard for legislators to compromise and negotiate all those points of view. So we just need to think about ways to encourage news organizations to be a little less polarized, because we think the media are contributing excessively to the polarization. There's a lot of hyper-partisanship in the contemporary era, and sometimes the media seem to encourage that. And so we're just trying to think about ways to decrease the polarization and decrease the hyper-partisanship so that we can have more thoughtful discussions of major issues.
Well, let's look into some of your recommendations. You list as a second one that the media should include a broader range of sources and add links to outside organizations that provide more in-depth coverage. I mean, isn't that exactly what's happening? Anytime I'm interested in a news story, I could always get to the source document, the same document the reporter read, and usually to extract a couple of things out of context. And if I'm motivated, I can read the whole document myself. And when have we ever had more access to that?
Absolutely. That's a very good feature of the current Internet world, and it's something that we want to encourage. There are a lot of serious news organizations that do that. They're very good at including the hyperlinks, so they might have a short summary of what a report says, but they would include a link, and so people want greater information, they can click through. But not all news organizations are doing that. Some basically will do the quick summary, but not have the links, and so we're trying to discourage the latter behavior and encourage news organizations to include those links.
Well, the way the market discourages is you stop going there for your news because you know you're just going to get the News McNuggets version.
Yeah, and certainly people can protect themselves. People who are really interested in a lot of information have developed ways to draw on the diversity of the web and get multiple points of view and get the in-depth coverage that they want. But not every consumer is has the time to do that or is motivated to do that. So there are a lot of people who don't engage in that type of behavior and don't take advantage of all the information resources that are out there. A lot of people are busy with multiple jobs, taking care of their families, taking care of kids, and so on. And so the news portion of their days is very limited. And so we just need to make sure that those people are able to kind of take advantage of the diverse information that's out there.
Not nearly as limited as they were when I grew up, when you got 15 minutes of Walter Cronkite, and that was it.
I grew up in exactly the same time period. I remember when I was growing up, we had the three networks. So we got a daily newspaper. There were a handful of popular radio shows. I mean, I much prefer the diversity of information that we have today. But the problem is not everybody is taking advantage of that diversity. There are many people who are still relying on just a handful of sources, often from one political perspective, whether it's of the left or the right.
Or the Daily Show.
And that contributes to the polarization of our political process.
I'm amazed how many people get their news from the Daily Show.
This is true. A lot of young people draw very heavily on the Daily Show. And, that's helpful in a certain respect, but oftentimes that's coming from a particular point of view as well. So, regardless of whether one is liberal, conservative, libertarian, populist, or whatever, people should try and avail themselves of broader points of view.
Your fourth recommendation is that social media need to incorporate broader means of reaction in their platforms. I mean, almost everybody has a comments section now. And if you take the time to read them, most of them are uninformed, untrained, unnuanced voices. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but how does all that cacophony of usually bitter partisanship add to the story?
I agree that a comment section, it's something that was an idea that people thought would lead to more interactive discussion and lead to a greater thoughtfulness. And in fact, it's actually had the opposite impact. It has encouraged emotional reactions and arguments, and oftentimes comments reflect greater polarization in people's thinking. But I think where we can do a better job on social media is we need to move beyond just a simple like button to maybe there's a range of different things that people want to incorporate on their sites. You could have a like button, you could have a dislike button, you could have a respect button. You could kind of think about a range of different ways that people could rate that story that would be informative for other people. People are looking for different things in the news, and you could have multiple buttons that would allow consumers to rate stories on those particular dimensions.
You recommend that funders should endow investigative journalists to protect them from outside pressures. How does one endow a journalist, and who would those funders be?
The big problem that we see today is there's a lot of news commentary online and celebrity coverage and things like that. There's a lot less investigative journalism, with the exception of a few sites, and there's also been a startling decline in coverage of state and local government. And so what we were thinking about was ways to encourage funding models that would help those parts of the news world that aren't being well-funded in today's digital world. And so endowing investigative journalists was a way to kind of think about that.
So is that like a university endowment where they get a tenured lifetime position and there's a pile of money that pays them every year?
It could be that type of format. Basically, we were less interested in the individual holding that than just the idea that news organizations should have the financial means to support investigative journalists. Newspapers used to have a lot of these people. A lot of them were laid off or let go. And so that part of news organizations seems weaker now than 10 or 20 years ago. And the result we fear is a loss of accountability. There are, fewer resources to investigate government and figure out what's going on. And so our hope was, with that recommendation, to encourage organizations to take that responsibility seriously.
I mean, newspapers used to have a thriving classified advertising business, and that's disappeared, and that's why they're going broke. So who would endow these journalists? Let's say, would it be George Soros or Charles Koch who endowed an investigative journalist? And what kind of respect do you think that journalist would get if he took money from either of those people?
It could be wealthy individuals. It could be foundations. It could be nonprofit organizations. I think we're already seeing some signs of this. There are a number of wealthy individuals who've started to buy into news organizations. Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post. Pierre Midyar has started a new platform for investigative journalism. So we're seeing some examples of this. I just think it's an experiment where we need to see more to see if that's a route that would help improve journalism in the future.
Isn't that the William Randolph Hearst model?
It very well could be. It's actually interesting when you look at the history of polarization in America. The worst time periods were the 1790s, the 1890s, and then the 1990s continuing up to the current period. And in the 1890s, when Hearst was operating, he reached a point where he was not happy with the polarization of that era and the hyper-partisanship. And so he and Joseph Pulitzer and other industry leaders kind of formed prizes. That's where the Pulitzer Prize got its start. And so we might start to see some of the leading figures of our era who are unhappy with the polarizations step up and start to take some steps that would improve the level of news coverage.
Your report talks about the role of citizen journalists, and you worry they may be biased because they never receive professional training. Does receiving a journalism degree from, say, Columbia University make someone unbiased?
Absolutely not. And we don't think every journalist has to have a professional degree. Our paper actually suggests that there is a definite role for citizen journalists. Oftentimes today, when there is a late-breaking event, the people who are there on the scene provide some of the most important coverage. Certainly, at the time of the Boston bombing or in cases of natural disasters, this often is the case. So we think there is a role for the citizen journalist in today's news world.
And if they make a mistake, it's corrected a couple of days later. You've reached a point now as a consumer, when I see stories pop up at the fringes that haven't been vetted yet, you keep an eye on it. You say, okay, let's see if this sticks, or if it turns out it was a false report. Don't you think people are sophisticated enough to understand that?
They certainly are in certain kinds of situations. We've seen a lot of foreign developments. Recently the coverage of the Ukraine situation, where having the person on the street give his or her perspective was very valuable. I often found those types of comments to be very helpful just because they were there, they were in the middle of the situation, and they could provide a lot of insight into what is going on. We just have to realize that there's a lot of noise associated with that type of coverage, so there could be inaccuracies, there could be problems of that kind of news coverage if it's the only kind of coverage that we end up with.
In the time we have left, let me drill down a little bit into your concerns about false equivalence and the lack of nuance in reporting. How do you think the media should deal with issues of settled science?
I think in terms of questions of settled science, that's a subject where generally leading scientists have gone to conferences, they've looked at the research, they've formed conclusions that certain things seem to be resolved. But good scientists never resolve anything permanently because there's always new information that comes around, new studies, new approaches, new ways to think. So people should always be aware of who the new voices are, who are the critics, who's saying something that might be a little unconventional. There certainly is a role for that because sometimes the new advances in science come from those contrarian voices.
And so would you be in favor of equal time for both global warming alarmists and climate change deniers?
I would not in that situation just because you're talking about a situation where 98% of scientists believe that the world is getting warmer and that human activities are part of the reason that it's getting warmer. It's a very small number of people. Many of them don't have good credentials who are challenging that viewpoint. So I think it's a mistake when journalists equate those two perspectives when in reality, scientists overwhelmingly believe in global warming.
Fascinating. As we wrap up, there's been some reaction to your report. There was some concern that you're calling for a return to elite control of the news media. How would you react to that?
Our paper was not meant to return control to elites in terms of the way that news organizations function. In fact, we try and balance the crowd and the curators. We think that there's a role for each of them. And if we want news coverage to do a better job in the future, you need the citizen journalists, but you also need the editors and the curators who can encourage people to read more thoughtful coverage.
Well, one thing is certainly true. We're going to get plenty of it in the years ahead. The technology never rests, and I don't think I've ever read more news in my life than I'm reading now. So it's an exciting time to be a consumer.
Exactly.
Darrell, thanks so much for being on the show.
Okay, thank you.
We've been talking with Darrell West, Vice President for Governance and Founding Director of the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution. Ahead, we'll hear what Mike Gonzalez from the Heritage Foundation thinks of Darrell's recommendations. Drop me an email at bill@realclearradio.org to let me know what you think. This is Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Stay tuned.